living longer, living healthier, living better than ever before. Welcome to Mountain Pacific's Healthy Living for Life, a weekly series that gives you the information, education, and expert insight you need to become an active participant in today's ever-changing healthcare climate. Here now is today's program host.
In the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have had to deal with feelings of grief and loneliness, whether it's a loss of a loved one or dealing with a divided and changed world. Grief is a normal response during a traumatic event, but how can we better manage our mental health? Welcome to Healthy Living for Life, a show dedicated to helping you do just that. I'm Sarah Medley, your host. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Healthy Living for Life. Joining us today is Dr. Reza Gomi from Frontier Psychiatry, headquartered in Billings, Montana. Thanks for being here with us.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks for having me.
Let's talk about some of the more common reasons people experience grief, and can grief be defined?
Sure. I think thinking about the definition of grief, I think most of us probably think of some combination of grief as being a result of loss. We're losing something. I think most commonly we think of, losing a loved one, losing someone we really had some sort of attachment to. I think there's varying levels of grief. So of course, the closer someone is to you, the more complicated and extreme, I guess, the grief can feel. But I think we think of grief as that feeling where we are, and it's multiple feelings, but it results from some losing something. And it's not always someone. It could be losing like a part of ourselves, in the sense of like watching our, kids get older, right? And they go off to college or they leave the house. And so there's all kinds of normal grief as well. So I want to make sure we're not calling all grief necessarily negative, but it's a normal part of life.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to emphasize, because I don't think we always realize that we experience grief when we have life changes, like kids, empty nester, or, right, changing jobs and missing a certain aspect of a job, or even retiring for that matter. Mm-hmm. So that's important. How has the COVID-19 pandemic caused grief?
I think COVID has brought grief and an experience of grief, even if we don't know it's happening, but to the forefront, because it was a sudden and drastic change in our day-to-day. And so inevitably, all of us experienced loss. Not all of us necessarily lost, a loved one, although many of us did. But we all lost our routines. We all lost our connections. Things were just so disrupted. So I think really across the world, especially across our country and our state, Montana, we've experienced grief. And it might not have always been obvious. I think a lot of us might have said, man, what's going on? One day I was going to work normally, now I'm not, and now the kids are home, they can't go to school. There's a lot of emotions mixed up in there, but certainly grief was central.
Does grief have symptoms? Absolutely.
It's interesting. I think a lot of us think of stages of grief. I think some things that were popularized over the last several decades were kind of different stages. And so we think of, there were some famous researchers like Kubler-Ross that popularized some stages. And so some of the ones that we tend to think of are like denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. So a lot of times we refer to these like 5 stages of grief. But keep in mind, over the years, while we've researched this, people jump around, people experience some, not others. So I think initially we took it very literally, like you start, off in denial, then you move to anger, then bargaining, then depression and acceptance and so on. That's really not, some people do, but that's really not typical. So keep in mind, there's nothing standard about grief, but it does help put a little bit of structure around the experience. And so, for example, with denial, you might have some avoidance of something. You might not empty out that closet. You might not pick up that phone and have that conversation. And you might be feeling numb. You might be feeling in shock. You might be feeling confused. So those are helpful to think about, I'm in denial because what it looks like and what it feels like. I think that's just helpful to identify, and then helps us reach out for help and say, wow, 6 months flew by and I haven't looked into this, that I need to do this thing I need to do. So I think there's symptoms that come along with everything, like anger and bargaining and so on, that are very healthy to talk about, to be aware of.
Mm-hmm. What about grief and its impact on our physical well-being? Does it have an impact?
Absolutely. I think the emotions of grief can have all kinds of internal experiences. And so we might feel, for example, the anger, we might be really angry with some sort of loss. And so we're going to feel, this kind of energy inside of us, this warmth, this heating up, this tension. We might be feeling depressed or anxious. So we feel that pit in our stomach, a tightness, in our chest. And so I think the spectrum of emotions can physically be felt, and grief will certainly cause those. And it just depends on what stage of grief and where we are in that cycle. But I think, you can be prepared to feel really a number of things with grief.
And then I've been asked at times, how long can feelings of grief last? And is it possible to grieve too long?
So that's a great question, and we have different terms like bereavement, and complex grief, complex bereavement. In the mental health world, based on some data, we typically consider, for most losses, let's say you lost a loved one, something that comes to mind, up to 6 months is typically considered normal bereavement or normal grief. And so keep in mind, everyone's different. It might take a few days, depending on what happened. It might take several months. And normal grief means that you're able to kind of get back to your day-to-day. You might still have feelings of sadness for years, and that's okay. It's really, when we're talking about grief, I think it's reaching this threshold that might really be impacting you and making it hard to do things. And so I think keep in mind 6 months or less is usually the rough guide we use.
Oh, that's very helpful. So we need to take a break, but when we come back, we're going to talk about loneliness and grief and how those two might go hand in hand. So don't go away. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're talking with Dr. Reza Gomi with Frontier Psychiatry. So again, thanks so much for coming on our show.
You're very welcome.
Let's talk about loneliness and grief. How are loneliness and grief related?
Great question. I know it can be kind of hard to separate a lot of these terms we hear in our own heads, but thinking about these things is so important. In terms of helping and taking care of ourselves and our loved ones. Loneliness can certainly result from or become combined or result from grief. I think grief, when we talked about, is the sort of result of a loss, some sense of loss. Loneliness might result from that loss. And so maybe we did lose somebody we spent a lot of time with or had a strong connection to, and that might result in feeling lonely. And that's okay. That's something we want to be aware of, because what we'll get into is talking about how we replace that feeling. And so that sometimes that leads to good things, sometimes that leads to not so healthy behaviors. But I think of loneliness as feeling like something is missing, and so that can result, but it can kind of go hand in hand with grief when you have a loss.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think too about the difference between being alone and experiencing loneliness, right? And so I think many of us enjoy being alone, but talk about the difference there.
Sure. I think being alone or having some solitude, some peace and quiet, we like to say, that's all very normal and healthy. And I think some of us have an easier time being alone than others. And so for those of us that maybe struggle with being alone, that's a good pause for reflection and trying to understand, where does that come from? Because there's always a reason, right? Depending on how we were brought up and all kinds of factors, we might really struggle with solitude, that peace and quiet. And there's reasons for it. Being alone can help us recharge our batteries, can help us take care of ourselves, really grow that that sense of independence and self-reliance. Now, too much alone time, we also know, is not healthy because our brains need stimulation and variety, and we need to get out there. So some of us rely on our animals, for stimulating some of that, but we also rely on each other. And so keep in mind, loneliness is really more a resulting feeling like something is missing. But being alone is something we can choose and help us recharge our batteries and not be because, something is missing. There's nothing inherently wrong with being alone.
So something we talked about earlier related to grief and symptoms. Does loneliness have symptoms?
Yeah, I think most of us experience loneliness when we are sort of maybe out of our day-to-day balance, when maybe there's a sort of a gap of time on our schedule that is normally filled and something's not sort of expected. That tends to leave some of us feeling lonely, thinking, man, I wish, I had someone or something here to do or to see or spend time with. And again, that I would point out is a great point to pause and say, hey, is this actually a good time to have some solitude and some alone time? Or maybe I haven't seen someone legitimately in too long and I really need to fill that time. I think the common theme here is building in some mindfulness to know what the difference is and to pause and say, wait a second, instead of kind of knee jerk or quickly reacting and say, I'm going to go fill up that time with something because I am feeling lonely. We can pause. And that pause is really what makes a big difference because it gives you a choice. You're not just reacting, you're then choosing. And if you're choosing to spend time with someone, great. If you're choosing to be alone, then great. It's a choice that draws that line between, healthy behaviors and doing what you need.
Are some people more likely to feel lonely than others?
I think that is a great question, and I do think the answer is yes. I think, and you have to keep in mind, a lot of this is things you have to learn as an adult that are unfortunately you had no control over because it's might have been things you were exposed to when you were younger, might be part of it's genetic. It's always a mixed bag. But if you think about it, some of us were raised with a very boisterous and loud environment with lots of stimulation, lots of people around. It's going to naturally be harder for us when we do eventually find ourselves in a position where we don't have that stimulation. And that's a moment to learn. Some of us were raised in a much quieter environment with less stimulation or more alone time, and that might be easier for us. Either way, there's nothing wrong with that. For both scenarios, it's going to be a point for learning as you get older to balance. And that's what's important.
So I have read, studies have shown that lonely people might have a higher mortality rate. Can people die from loneliness?
Yeah, and I think that's getting into that more severe loneliness that is more akin to social isolation. And we know that social isolation, frankly, is deadly. It's very well correlated to mortality, lower life expectancy, especially as you get older and are in those stages of life where you really need that stimulation. So that's how we know that our brains need stimulation. So if you go days without talking to anyone, we know that's not really healthy for just about anyone. There are such things as, meditation retreats and things, but those are things that are planned and scheduled and once in a great while. But when you're chronically isolated, we know that loneliness is really not good news.
Well, we need to pause for another break, but viewers, when we come back, we're going to talk about what we can do to cope better with grief and loneliness. So stay tuned. Welcome back. We are continuing to talk about dealing with grief and loneliness with Dr. Gomi from Frontier Psychiatry. So again, we appreciate you.
Welcome.
Let's talk about different kinds of grief And can people feel grief from different kinds of things other than the loss, say, of a spouse or child?
Absolutely. I think anything that throws a wrench in our normal routine, and because, as humans, we grow attachments, not just to people, but to what we come to expect day to day. And it might be an experience. It might be something that just regularly we go through. And so when that changes, like you pointed out earlier, the loss of our work schedule from COVID or empty nester syndrome, right, with kids leaving the house, or having to, leave a home that you built for 30, 40 years and, downsize. And so all those things can kind of be a trigger for grief. And so the process is really the same. It might not be as obvious because you might think to yourself, I think a lot of people might discount it and say, well, I shouldn't be having so much trouble. I'm just moving. What's the big deal? But what we have to remember is, as humans, we have an amazing capacity for memory. And so it's not just moving, it's what that represents, right? So in that home you had for all those years, think about all the memories that were made there. So the experience can be like you're losing those memories. And I think being open to accepting that, talking about it, and just giving it its space, not necessarily shutting it down or dismissing it. let those emotions come. That's what really helps grief get processed. That's what lets us move forward.
Very good point. Don't try and hinder that grief necessarily, but work through it. Good point. Right. Well, it isn't just adults that experience grief. I mean, common sense would tell us that's everyone, including children. So how can we help a child who is grieving?
Sure. I think it can be so hard to approach a child, and maybe the younger, the harder it is, because we may forget. Sometimes we look at our kids, maybe they're toddlers still, maybe they're in grade school, and we think, I'm just not going to tell them about this loss, so I'm not going to really share, I'm not going to bring it up. I get that. I think that can be intuitively, you're trying to protect that child. But what we know is that it can cause more problems in the long run. And children actually do better when you can bring up a loss or grief and talk about it. For example, it's okay to talk about death with kids. Am I going to show them graphic images, when they're 4 or 5? Of course not. But it's okay to teach them and to show them, that caterpillar we were looking at, it's not alive anymore. It's dead now. And it's okay to use those terms and to teach them they're gone. And it depends on culture and religion, appropriately for whatever you believe in. But you don't have to get into much more detail. But it's really important for them to understand that there's a state in which things are no longer around, and it might be loss of something else too, like their friend moving away. So pointing all that out and actually talking to them about it is really what helps a child process a grief and that emotion. Because keep in mind, what do children do? At that point, the world revolves around them. They don't understand the bigger world out there, and so they have a tendency, if we don't bring it up, to blame themselves. Right. And so they have a tendency to say, well, it must have been my fault. It was about me. And so it's really, really important to talk about that. So they know this had nothing to do with you. It's really sad. It's something that happens. It's normal. And letting them know that's critical.
Oh, that is so helpful. So are there coping strategies that we could help our children or grandchildren learn?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Some talking it through is appropriate. I think the coping strategies for kids is, when you're spending time with your child or any loved one, a family member that's a child, while let's say you're doing an activity with them, age appropriately. Let's say you're playing with some toys with a younger child, and giving them that space. You might tell them while you're playing, maybe they appear sad, or they might, kids will bring it up kind of what we feel like is a random time, in the middle of playing, they'll say, hey, where did grandpa go? And they might say something. That's the kind of the opening. So it's a key there is to not brush it off, even though it'll be so out of left field. We'll think we'll talk about this later. So we've got to kind of meet kids where they are, take a little pause, and then talk about it, but then go back to the activity so that they understand, okay, I was able to process this a little bit, and then, can come back to it later. Because, their brains, they're going to kind of come back and forth and process in chunks. You're not going to be able to have this long conversation with a child. And so I think coping strategy wise, just meet your child or the child where they are, and just keep that in mind.
Good advice. If we know someone who is grieving, how can we help them so they don't feel alone?
A great question. And I think, I can think of times where, I was worried about somebody grieving, and it's just, I think, leaving the door open. So there are moments where you could approach that person and say, hey, I'm here for you. If you want to talk, give them that opening. Sometimes it's hard to know, do they need a little bit of a push? Are they the kind of person that's going to come to me? Or do I feel like I don't want to make this feel like an empty promise or empty offer? And so in that situation, if it's not being volunteered, I would say set up an activity together then. Tell them, hey, let's go for a walk. Let's talk about, the birds. Let's talk about something else. Just like when we were kids, right? That might open up the comfort and get things flowing, and it might come out at that point. So keep in mind, it's not always going head first into it, but maybe do something else that you enjoy doing with that person.
We're almost out of time, but is there anything you would like to add or reiterate in about 30 seconds?
Sure. Lots I can think of, but really, I think the big message today is keeping in mind that much of what we experience, right, is normal. And what I would love for everyone to take away is just knowing that pausing and being mindful of the experience is key. And whatever that experience is, just being aware, if you're at a point where it's getting in the way of your day-to-day, if you're having trouble functioning, please ask for help. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Call your primary care. If you have a therapist, great. Or, go online and look around and just reach out. But I think the more we're able to reach out for help, the more we're able to help. Thank you so much, Dr. Gomi. Great advice. So viewers, that's all the time we have left today. Thank you for watching. And we all hope that you'll come back and join us again next week. Until then, stay fit, stay well, stay healthy for life with Healthy Living for Life. Take care, everyone.
Healthy Living for Life is brought to you by Mountain Pacific Quality Health in partnership with AARP Montana. We'd love to hear from you. If you have suggestions for future programs, visit our website at mpqhf.org or call us at 406-443-4020. You can also catch us on YouTube by visiting our website and clicking on the Healthy Living for Life logo. Production facilities provided by Video Express Productions.